Good morning. Did everyone have a nice time last night? Again, another thanks to Draeger for sponsoring a lovely evening. And we are so delighted that everyone is back this morning. Yesterday was a wonderful day. I think everyone learned at least 1, 5, 20 different things that you didn't know before you came. And that's the point of this, that and to network and make sure that we are all in support of kicking off NACID. And today we've got another wonderful kind of jam-packed agenda. And so encourage you to formulate your questions and be prepared at the end of these sessions to ask our experts. We'll also today finish up by kind of doing some of the, kind of prioritization that we did yesterday. And so again, welcome to our online folks, as well as all of you in the room. And I'd like to welcome another generous sponsor of this conference, Aaron Holmes and Abbott. Really appreciate you coming up here and having a word for the audience.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. So wonderful to see you all in person and not via a laptop screen. I want to start off first and foremost by recognizing my former colleagues at responsibility.org for the incredible job that they've done in putting this conference together and, more importantly, bringing NACID to fruition. They're some of the most talented and dedicated people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with, and I'm just honored to be included as they actualize this life-saving movement, which I truly believe is going to be huge in influencing change in this country. I am now serving as the Director of Global Road Safety at Abbott, which is a company that many of you are probably familiar with. It's been around since 1888, established by a physician in Chicago, and we're of course known primarily for our work in the healthcare space, whether it's our nutrition, our medical instruments, and most recently, of course, our rapid diagnostics. But we also have a focus on toxicology, which is what this morning's panel is going to be talking about. When I moved over to Abbott, I learned that the focus of the company is on helping people live life to their fullest so that they can enjoy their life in a healthy manner. Well, in addition to that, Abbott is also now focused on creating safer roads as a function of that overarching mission. And in doing so, we have technology, which you heard about yesterday, which is oral fluid screening. Toxa is a portable analyzer that can be used by law enforcement at Roadside to identify drivers under the influence of drugs, and of course then remove them from the roadways, thereby protecting public safety. And also importantly, it's an opportunity to identify those who are under the influence of multiple substances so we can make more informed decisions as they make their way through the criminal justice system with supervision and treatment so that they can hopefully achieve long-term behavior change. We've seen tremendous progress in recent years on the international front in this area. We have programs in Spain, Germany, the UK, my home of Canada, and most recently here in the United States, with, of course, Brian's involvement in Michigan, more recently in Alabama, and of course, Indiana. And I encourage you all to touch base with Rob Duckworth to learn about the amazing things that they have going on there. I truly believe that NACID is going to be an opportunity to achieve momentum. We're really at that point in this country. And Abbott is very proud to stand alongside all of you in hopefully creating those safer roads and saving lives. And just as a personal note to Brian, we've had the opportunity, the pleasure, the honor to work alongside you for many years now. You're an inspiration every single day to the work that we do. I am humbled that we get to actualize your vision and hopefully ensure that the SWIFT law gets implemented throughout the country, but proactively, so that we don't have to have laws named in memoriam of other families like yours. So thank you all so much, and we look forward to working with you all.
Thanks again to Aaron and Abbott. We really appreciate your support. Next, we're going to be discussing toxicology. Issues, challenges, and project goals. And I'd like to introduce Jennifer Harmon from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department Regional Crime Lab, who will introduce the rest of the panel. Please welcome the rest of this panel.
If that's okay with everybody. I'm Jennifer Harmon. I'm a crime lab director from San Diego County in California. I've been a forensic toxicologist for more than 20 years and have had the opportunity to work in 2 of the 3 largest jurisdictions in California in toxicology specifically. And we're joined by a whole panel of experts on public policy and in toxicology today, so we look forward to kind of talking about some of the challenges. I wanted to echo some things that were said yesterday by Chief Myers, that we really are in traffic safety, and especially in the labs, dealing with a bit of an iceberg. I, too, as a crime lab director that oversees 10 different forensic disciplines, spend most of my time talking about the same crimes that Matt gets asked about every day. And we have to continue to reiterate the importance that traffic safety has, that vehicles are deadly weapons too, and that our goal in traffic safety and the testing that we do is a lot of times about preventing the felonies and preventing the fatal accidents, so that we don't have people who reoffend. And to do that, we have to standardize, we have to have the resources that are needed, the infrastructure and the staffing to conduct the testing that we need to conduct. And that testing changes because we deal with drugs du jour on a regular basis. In the county that I'm in, 81% of our felony arrested drivers have alcohol and at least 1 additional drug in their system. And of our DUI drivers that have an average of a 0.19% blood alcohol level, also 53% of them also have at least 1 other drug. Polysubstance use is not rare, it is more the norm. And I can say in the last probably 5 to 10 years, the shift I've seen in the jurisdictions I've overseen is that we actually are getting more cases involving polydrug and drug use than alcohol use alone. So we're going to start today. We have on our panel, we have Jake Nelson. Jake is the Director of Traffic Safety Advocacy and Research for the AAA. We have Christine Moore, Dr. Christine Moore. She was here yesterday. She's with 9 Delta Analytical and a fellow forensic toxicologist. And Amy Miles, last but not least, certainly not least, Amy Miles, Director of Forensic Toxicology at the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. She also happens to be the current president of the Society of Forensic Toxicologists, so that's a big deal for all of us too. So Jake, I think you're going to get us started.
All right, I'm going to be a rebel, and I think Dr. Moore is too, and stand.
Okay.
I'm going to stand as well.
We're like sharks. If we don't keep moving, we sink. So I'm going to start off with a little pop quiz just to wake us up, and all the answers to these questions were given yesterday. So Darren gave us the charge of connecting our topic to multiple substance impaired driving. So on the topic of using oral fluid to detect drugs, what is the single greatest benefit of using oral fluid over other specimen for that purpose? Anyone? And if no one raises their hand, I'm going to call on you, because I only get 15 minutes.
Come on, people.
Anyone?
Collection time. Come on.
This corner over here, NTSB friend. Speed. So collecting it closer to the time that the person was driving. Exactly right. So let's talk a little bit about the words that we use to talk about the use of this specimen. So screening versus testing. So if we collect the specimen and we conduct the chemical testing at the roadside, which of those 2 words should we be using? Screening. But in practice, when we hear about oral fluid testing, most people think of screening, right? And that's also where there is the most misinformation about this technology and how it can be used. So we have to be really careful to use the right words to talk about exactly what we're referring to, especially if we're in an environment where we're trying to advocate for a program to start or be expanded. We want to make sure that we're very clear if we're talking about roadside screening versus the chemical testing in a laboratory, the results of which can be evidentiary and used in court. Okay? Let's talk about how the results of these 2 different practices can be used. So the results of roadside screening, what is that used for? And there's more than one answer, so just throw some out. Probable cause. What's another decision that someone at the roadside might use those results to make? There you go. So these are the most common uses of the results of roadside screening. And so the results of chemical testing using oral fluid as a specimen in the laboratory is used for what? Evidence, same as blood, right? Very good. So I'm impressed. This is what most people get wrong, so I'm really glad that you guys are paying attention yesterday. So I'm going to talk about sort of the state of the states, the policy environment that's conducive to starting or expanding a roadside screening program or a lab-based chemical testing program using oral fluid as a specimen. So there are three general sort of ways in which that this can happen. And so one is, your implied consent law extends to oral fluid. All right, so that's the most common way. You also have elsewhere in the impaired driving statute, the use of or collection of oral fluid for chemical testing in this context can be authorized. And then the third is for temporary research purposes. So for pilot testing, like what happened in Michigan. And pilot tests like that have happened in many other states as well, not statewide like in Michigan, but that's not uncommon to have happened in the past. So whether you seek to authorize the use of oral fluid in this context, somewhere in your statute or specifically by implied consent, the law has to authorize the collection of that specimen for use in this context. And it also has to extend to drugs other than alcohol. And we talked a little bit yesterday, I think it was during Jen's session, about some of the challenges in the way that drugs are defined in the code and the limits that can, or the barriers that can create when trying to bring an impaired driving charge for a drug that's not listed in statute. And so another example of where words matter a lot. There are about 40 states at least that authorize blood for this purpose. And you heard from Dr. Kurt Harper yesterday a little bit about some of the states that still use urine, and Dr. Moore was not shy about her opinion about whether that's a good or a bad idea. So let's not forget that. There are at least 23 states, so about half the states authorize in one way or another the use of oral fluid to detect drug drivers in an impaired driving context. But I think only about 5 states currently in practice use the technology either at Roadside or have lab-based programs. And I'm going to walk through a few examples of that now. So here's sort of the lay of the land, what it looks like. And actually, this map needs to be updated because in Alabama, it is now, or the use of oral fluid for this purpose is now covered by the implied consent law, but also elsewhere in the statute. So we'll have to figure out a way to indicate states that do it in multiple ways. So anyone here from Indiana? Just raise your hand. All right. So in Indiana, and you guys can fact check me and keep me honest. So in Indiana, they use roadside screening of oral fluid. And they use that for the 2 reasons that we talked about, to make a decision about whether to call a DRE to assist on the case or to build probable cause to get a search warrant to collect blood. So as you heard from Dr. Harper yesterday, let's say you're a state, whether you're authorized to do it or not, but you don't in practice have an oral fluid program either at Roadside or in the laboratory, and you're interested in doing that, you can do one, you can do the other, you can do both. So this is an example of a state that does one, and the one that they choose to do is roadside screening, and we've talked about why or how they use those results. In Ohio, they currently don't use oral fluid, either at the roadside or in the laboratory. Is anyone here from Ohio? So in Ohio, I know that they're very interested in starting a lab program. They have no interest in exploring the use of oral fluid at Roadside. They don't buy the technology. They don't think that it's reliable. And this is why it's really important that when we're in other states and we're talking about the use of oral fluid in this context, that we're specific about whether we're talking about screening or a lab program and the strengths and limitations of each of those ways that you can use oral fluid in impaired driving cases. So in Alabama, you heard from Dr. Kurt Harper yesterday. He talked about his program, and actually this slide needs to be updated too. I think that legislation has been signed by the governor, right? So now in Alabama, use of oral fluid is covered generally in the statute, also by the implied consent law, and they have a roadside screening program, a lab-based testing program as well. So they do both. More recently, in Vermont, at the end of last year, passed legislation to start an oral fluid lab-based program. But there's a little catch or hiccup in their law that has not been corrected. Is there anyone here from Vermont? Sir, can you explain to us what the challenge is in Vermont with the law as it exists currently? Not to say that it won't be fixed. That's okay. This is a safe space. We can be wrong. We're here to learn. So here's the challenge in Vermont, is you can't collect the specimen at the roadside. And what did we talk about was the single greatest benefit of collecting oral fluid in this context? Collecting it proximate to the time that the person was driving. So in Vermont, you can't do that. So is there a significant benefit of collecting oral fluid in Vermont as compared to blood if the law remains as is and you can't collect it at the roadside? Not really. So I'm hoping that they change that. Question?
But there may be in that issues of use at trial may be easier when you're talking about oral fluid as opposed to requiring either an electronic warrant or consent for blood. There may be that advantage.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but we have some prosecutors here that I'm sure that do, and we'll speak up during the Q&A. So complicating factors. So there are loopholes in the laws even for the use of blood as a specimen. And so some examples of that will be that you can only collect the sample in an impaired driving case if there was a serious injury or a fatality. Other loopholes, you can only collect it for some drugs. Only a DRE can collect it. And there are many more examples of loopholes and challenges, and we should expect to see those same kinds of loopholes and challenges for the use of oral fluid as a specimen in states that choose to expand or start programs either at Roadside or in the laboratory as well. You know, the reason why I did the quiz to start is because of the misinformation that's out there about the use of oral fluid in this context. And so again, just want to emphasize that if you talk to a lawmaker, generally speaking, you should expect that when you say, oh, oral fluid testing, they're immediately thinking of the roadside screen and they're immediately calling into question the accuracy and reliability of those instruments. Technology is getting better all the time. And let's talk about screening for just a second. We shouldn't expect perfection in roadside screening instruments. We don't make medical diagnoses using screening tests for a reason, because they're not always accurate and reliable. But they do flag the need to dig deeper and to do additional testing so that you can make diagnoses. And we should think about roadside screening in this context using oral fluid in exactly the same way. It's an imperfect method. It helps us to make better decisions, but it doesn't allow us to make conclusions about whether somebody is impaired or not, how impaired they are, or whether you can even arrest them just using that information alone. It's one additional tool, and it doesn't allow us to treat drug-impaired drivers the way we can alcohol-impaired drivers using a portable breath testing device. And let's talk just for a minute about why that is. What is the relationship that exists between how much alcohol is in your blood versus how impaired you are, that we don't have established for any other drug but alcohol? I mean, I see heads nodding, so I won't use up my 15 minutes to get it right out. We don't have that dose-response relationship established for any drug but alcohol. So having that result, whether at the roadside or in a laboratory, doesn't allow us to make conclusions about whether somebody is impaired or how impaired they were. And I know that a large majority of you in this room know that, but legislators do not. And they make assumptions about what the results of these tests, whether conducted in a laboratory or obtained at roadside, how they can be used and what they mean and what they don't. So we have to be careful to always educate folks and make sure that they understand that. Obviously, funding is a big barrier. The backlog at existing labs, and I think about what they've done in Alabama, collecting oral fluid and blood, to try to compare those results over time and help build confidence within the state to use oral fluid in that context. And so that makes good sense, but with funding as a barrier, and now you're gonna double the amount of samples potentially to run on any given case, can create its own set of challenges and barriers. And we heard from Dr. Moore yesterday about the incentive structure that exists in almost all states relative to having an impaired driver that has alcohol on board at 0.08 or higher with no graduated or additional charges or sanctions to have drugs other than alcohol also on board. That may explain the observed impairment. So if the offender isn't going to serve any more jail time, pay $1 more in fines, no additional penalties or points on the license, then what is the incentive to continue expending the time and the resources and the lab fees and all those costs to investigate the drugs other than alcohol if you know you've got them on alcohol? So we have to think about the incentive structure that we're setting up as well. So strategies to boost, some of these are pretty straightforward, but let's go through them. We got to talk about the differences between roadside screening and testing, and I've emphasized that several times in my short amount of time up here. Dr. Kurt Harper talked about if states are interested in starting programs, what are the most important things to do? And he talked about a diverse coalition. Had the folks in Vermont gotten the right people around the table from the ground floor, the law would have been written better and we wouldn't have this challenge in Vermont. And that is a direct result of not involving the right people early in the process who would have flagged that immediately. And at this point, any one of you would have flagged that, which is good. So we can do that, make sure that that happens in other states. Adjusting the incentive structure and really trying to articulate the return on investment for using oral fluid either at roadside or in the laboratory in the context of impaired driving prevention. So I'm going to stop there and yield my time to my other rebel friend who's going to walk.
Okay, thank you. Nice presentation, Jake. It's very, very helpful and a good introduction. I'm going to delve a little further into oral fluid today. Fact or fiction? Well, I could go on for 20 minutes at least on this, but we'll just do the one slide to start with.
At least you get 7 more slides.
With very small font, as I mentioned. So what you hear most of all is that oral fluid, well, it's unreliable. You hear that all the time. So in 2003 and even before that, in Europe, they had a thing called the Rosita project and a thing called the Druid project. And they used these roadside devices and they tested them and they found that some of them were not reliable. That is absolutely true, but that was 15, 20 years ago. And we all know that technology improves as we go. So the fact is that these current devices are much improved, and there are lots of peer-reviewed publications now that attest that they are accurate and reliable. Many societies worldwide have embraced using oral fluid as a drug testing matrix, and not least of which SAMHSA for the Federal Workplace Drug Testing Program here in the US, and the European Workplace Drug Testing Society also allow oral fluid to be used. It's used in pain management, it's used in criminal justice, so it is reliable. When you hear somebody say it's not reliable, they're either very old or they haven't read the literature, recently, I would say. Oral fluid is not as accurate as blood. I hear that all the time too. So what are we basing that on? What roadside device for blood do we have? There isn't one. You can't compare that because apples to apples is not existing there. If you collect a sample for laboratory testing, as Dr. Harper talked about yesterday, you use the exact same technology as you do for blood. So it's the same. As long as the methods are validated and the lab knows what they're doing, it's just as reliable as blood. So that's just fiction. It's true that oral fluid is not as good for some drugs, specifically in our case in traffic safety, benzodiazepines. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. But it's actually better for things like cocaine, methamphetamine. Those accumulate a lot better in oral fluid than they do in blood. Kind of an easy way to remember it, if it gets you high, if it's a stimulant, it shows up real well in oral fluid. If it makes you depressed, like benzos or barbiturates, those are low in oral fluid relative to blood. So it's not totally always the case, but it's a nice rule of thumb to have. Things like oxycodone and tramadol, or pain medications, those accumulate really well in oral fluid. So it just depends. All the drugs are different. This is one of my pet peeves. So this was a literature report that came out, and if you're anything like me, I read the abstract and then I read the conclusion, and I'm done. Unless it's like, oh, I really should probably read the middle of the paper and see what they're saying. So I look at this, and if you read this abstract, this is the Draeger device. According to this group, the false positive results with that device, look at these numbers, they're huge on the false positives. 87% cocaine, you'd be thinking, why are we using this device? This is terrible. You know what you need to do is go read the rest of the paper. They did the roadside test, and then 4 hours later, they collected the blood. So is that really a false positive? No, of course not. You spent 2 to 4 hours collecting a sample. If you're going to write this paper, you have to collect the samples at the same time. So talk about apples and oranges. So don't be fooled about what it is that you read in the literature. They tried to caveat that a little bit with saying, well, our lab test is much lower testing than the roadside. So it might have been, would have caught the ones in 4 hours. No, you wouldn't. For the exact reasons I've just said to you, each drug is different. The fact that you have X amount in oral fluid does not mean you have X amount in blood. The concentrations are different. The drug might be there, but the concentrations are different. And that's all to do with physiology of each drug. So what the authors finally said, if you read the whole paper, was, well, you know, we actually did find drugs in the oral fluid. The false negatives, the false positives, what? What did you find? Crazy. But the police then said, oh, that was a valuable tool. Guess what? It's great. We're using this device that you've just trashed in the abstract, but we've got double the apprehended drivers. So really bad. I mean, I think the things like this need to be more called out, and people like me should read the whole paper instead of just looking at the abstract. So I'm off my soapbox now. So this, Dr. Harper talked about yesterday. We've gone over this till you're all sick of it. I think you all know now why oral fluid is preferable in traffic safety collections to blood because of the time. We just had that in Jake's pop quiz. Oh, one thing I did want to mention. Also, Kurt had very similar information yesterday that you have like 5 nanograms-ish of THC in blood. That's equivalent to getting close to 500 in oral fluid. So they're not the same. And I really need to put this point through. A 5 nanogram in oral fluid is more like 0.2 in blood. So all the statutes that say we should look for 5 nanograms in blood, so therefore we should look for 5 nanograms in oral fluid, no. Okay. So roadside drug testing has been internationally accepted and adopted. These are quite a lot of the countries, which is very cleverly arranged in alphabetical order, I have to say. You can see all of these places have various degrees of programs and implementation. In the UK, arrests were up 600% since they started doing this. So I bet they're thrilled at that. Right? 600, I bet the police agree with that. So the devices that I have there are probably 30 maybe devices that are out there. The ones on the top that you see there are visually read. So you do the wiping and then you wait for a little while and you check to see if there's a line or not. That might be great for Kohl's or Walgreens or somewhere that's doing retail hiring at Christmas. Get the people in, are you positive, are you negative, off you go. It's great, but it's not great if you're a police officer in the middle of the night and it's raining and you're trying to see if there's a line on the car. No, that doesn't work. So again, in our situation, you need to get the bottom two that I have there are the Abbott Sotoxa and the Draeger Drug Test 5000, both of which are instrumented devices, both of which will have the instrument decide if it's positive, not you, not the officer looking for a line. So the instrument decides, it gets to keep that result. You get to print it later if you want to. You can download results. So for this application, you really need to have an instrumented device. The others are fine for different areas, but these two are the ones that are most written about. They're the most reliable in the market. Both of these devices would be excellent. So the US state evaluations and implementations, we've heard about Kurt's program in Alabama. I'll touch on Indiana and Michigan in my next slide. Massachusetts didn't bother to do any testing. They just wrote a report from everybody else's testing, which was, you know, a cheaper way to do it. Okay? But they did say that the Drug Test 5000 and the Sotoxa had adequate sensitivity, specificity, accuracy to be used in the field. Oklahoma and Kansas are completed. I'll get back to those in 1 second. Wisconsin did a first evaluation and that was published. The second one is awaiting its report. Miss Miles, Miss Amy Miles will be providing that report soon, so I hear. And Vermont, Jake mentioned that they might allow this collection for lab testing, but as an evidential sample, not the roadside test. To Oklahoma and Kansas, we had a couple of situations. The DREs were involved in the pilot studies, which is always good, of course. And in a couple of cases, what the DRE reported did not match what the devices reported. So Both were right, but they were different. So what happened was the DREs are seeing the drivers looking maybe down on the downside of things, lethargic. So they're reporting that it's a sedative, or what do they call it? What's it called? Depressant, thank you. A depressant, where the devices are showing a stimulant. So what's happening is that they're past that peak of methamphetamine or coke and the driver's on the downside. So both are right, but it was different drugs, not the different drugs, but different category that was reported by the DRE. So that was kind of interesting in both of those situations. So Indiana, we've heard about this, and I believe Mr. Duckworth is around somewhere. There he is, if you'd like to talk about Indiana's program. Theirs is the first program established and funded by the State Highway Safety Office. They opted to establish a permanent program rather than do a pilot, and they relied on the data from Michigan. So that's great. Again, you were using the same toothbrush as Michigan. There you go, well done. They obtained buy-in from key stakeholders and agencies, and they used the Sotoxa device. I should mention, the Sotoxa is a rebranding of the DDS2. So if anyone ever heard of the DDS2, it's the same. It just has a new name. The Criminal Justice Institute distributed 66 of these devices across the state. I got this information from the Indiana newspaper, so it must be true, that the devices cost $4,500 each, and NHTSA covered the costs through federal funding. Michigan, in their phase one, as we heard from Brian yesterday, their first pilot provided some good data on the performance of these devices, but they decided that there wasn't enough data in that first set. I think there were only 6 counties. So for phase 2, they expanded that to 69 counties. And the report came out, and one of the conclusions was that the roadside oral fluid testing in phase 2 has been proven to be accurate to a certain degree. Each of the drug classes was pretty accurate when compared to the gold standard, but not entirely. According to this, the oral fluid testing does not equal the gold standard, but has been found to be accurate for purposes of preliminary roadside testing. I couldn't get information on when they collected the blood samples, which I think is a huge missing piece of why it wasn't as not equal to, whatever that meant. However, and this has also been mentioned, that result doesn't show you whether the person is impaired or not. So that's in the field, pilot studies in the different states. But what about figuring out whether this device actually works like it's supposed to, as the manufacturers claim? So in April, this report came out, and it was an evaluation of 5 of these oral fluid field screening devices. And the purpose of it was to evaluate these devices to assess accuracy, reliability, performance, susceptibility to interference, resistance of the consumables to extremes of temperature, humidity, etc. And those were the 5 devices that were chosen back in 2017. So this work was done 4 years ago, but we got the report out in April. So phase 1, which I thought was actually quite good, a good idea. If you have to test numerous cutoffs on numerous devices above and below the cutoff, different drugs, cross-reactivity, that's an awful lot of spit that you have to collect. Right? You need a lot of human oral fluid to be spiking, to be testing. So phase 1 was, hey, can we use something synthetic so we don't have to ask people for their own saliva, which has to be negative? How do we know if it's negative to start with? So that was the first part, trying to get synthetic matrix that would act like a human saliva does. Then phase 2 was, did the devices hit the cutoffs that the manufacturers say they do? Phase 3, cross-reactivity with other drugs. These are immunoassay screens for the most part, and so you will get not just the target drug, you'll get other drugs in the class, like other opiates on the morphine assay, other benzos on the temazepam assay, etc. Then the effect of orange juice, coffee, milk, toothpaste, things that might normally be in the mouth was assessed. It's a good thing to do. And finally, the impact of temperature and humidity on the device consumables. So these are the parts of the device that go from the person into the machines, not the machine itself, which is obviously fairly rugged. In my experience, cold weather in Alaska, colder you get isn't going to affect anything. But hot weather in Arizona in the summer, that will. So, humidity and heat will destroy an enzyme much faster than the cold will. So it's 100 pages, so if you want to read that, have at it. And the bottom line was, they all behave differently per drug class. Oh, okay. So I suggest if you're going to do one of these, then you should go read the report and pick one of those 5. But it was a good report. So finally, to summarize, testing oral fluid is appropriate in many situations and certainly in DUID. These devices provide an initial rapid test for a few drug classes. We talked about expanding the drug panels, but they pick up the most common drugs. There are different cutoffs between devices, so make sure if you're going to do a pilot, you know what cutoffs you're getting, and it's a presumptive result only. This came up yesterday. A gentleman at the back, I think, asked this question about standard cutoffs, and was it up to NHTSA to do that? And then Jake mentioned why they couldn't do that at this point. But the US has no standard cutoffs for roadside testing. It does have them for workplace testing, but not for roadside. But Canada do, and they have cocaine at 50 nanograms per mil, and in their literature, they say that means that a recreational user would be positive for 4 to 6 hours at 50, okay? Methamphetamine, they say that also at 50, a single low dose user would be positive for 4 to 6 hours. So they're trying to get away from the people who maybe, they want recent use, let me put it that way, in driving. And THC at 25 nanograms per mil. They say that occasional smokers will generally be negative after 4 hours after using marijuana at that cutoff. But it more likely was to minimize issues that might be there with passive exposures to marijuana, because we haven't talked about that at all at this meeting yet. But if Jake is smoking pot and I'm standing next to him, my oral fluid could be positive.
That explains her behavior yesterday.
So there are publications on that. But of course, my level is much lower as being passively exposed. So that's why Canada thought to put up the cutoff to the 25, as opposed to some of the devices in Europe that are around 5 nanograms. So that's an interesting discussion also that we should probably have. This presumptive result may provide reasonable cause, as we've all talked about, to collect a subsequent evidentiary sample. And these, there are lab-based, not screening-based cutoff recommendations published by the National Safety Council. And within our own groups, I'm in the Society of Forensic Toxicology Oral Fluid Committee with Dr. Harper, AAA and National Safety Council all have committees and work groups that try and address some of these questions and discuss all the things that we're talking about here. So with that, I thank you very much.
I feel like I have to address now the second oral fluid project that Christine slowly rolled over me with her bus. So we had the issue which you all experienced, which was COVID, and officer safety. You know, we didn't feel like it was right to, and I prefer tenacious, but others say annoying or pushy, but I was trying to, you know, still encourage that we continue with it, but once it was the realization that that's just not right for law enforcement and they had enough to deal with, so COVID did put a pause on things. And then my staff member that's in charge of the project was going through grad school. So that was the other, I had to kind of give him a pass for that. And then he's getting married this weekend. So I was like, after you're married, your honeymoon will be oral fluid. So it is coming soon. It's just, you know, running a lab during COVID, and then everybody's got a life. So like Christine, when I was reading the email strings, because I think I missed a meeting along the way, and I had to reread it when I read 7 slides, after I got out of the fetal position, I realized I'm just going to do it through pictures. So this picture represents forensic science. All those kids in that classroom, the teacher up front is maybe highway safety or the federal government or Congress with all this money, and all the forensic disciplines are, raising their hands. I do think the child in the right that's just chilling, that's DNA. So I'm just gonna lay that out there. They use printers at footrests, and they don't need to be raising their hand anymore. And the kid in the back with 2 hands raised, that is forensic toxicology. And if I could, I'd have made him jump up and down. And our arms are tired. Our arms are tired. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and we have been having these same conversations, these same meetings over and over and over. When I first started in forensic toxicology, it was impressed upon me that our laboratory does over 20,000 cases a year. I know some of you are from Wisconsin in here, and some of you have lived there, Scotty Strong. We have a problem in our state, and we cannot do all of the testing that we need to do. So when I first started, actually the legal limit for blood alcohol was 0.1, that's how old I am. And we have always maintained, even today, that if that blood alcohol is above a 0.1, we do not pursue drug testing because we simply cannot test over 20,000 cases for drugs. As time has moved on though, and the lens was always, do what you have to do to support criminal justice. That's what we're here for. That's our main goal. We're here to support law enforcement, prosecution. Just do the testing that you need and be done. And as I clicked through my career, I got more involved with the DRE program and started to realize, well, that's not right, because people were seeing DREs come in maybe with somebody at a 105, and we should be doing that drug testing because look at all of these other symptomology that we're seeing for impairment. And it really hit home for me when we do both medical examiner casework and impaired driving casework at our lab. And I'm in the lab, dragging my knuckles around, and I was checking in medical examiner cases, and I came across a sample and I recognized the name, but I couldn't quite place why I knew it. And it was a high blood alcohol, 0.15, and a lot of other drugs present, opioids, methamphetamine. And so I get back to my desk and I see I have an email from a prosecutor for trial prep, which is amazing. That never happens. So you get really excited about it. And I started to look at the case and I realized it was actually that medical examiner case that I had just checked in, but that person had died, and it wasn't trial prep. He was calling to tell me, stop testing on any samples that you have for this person, they're deceased. And that's when I really realized what forensic toxicology and many other forensic science disciplines do goes so far beyond criminal justice. It is public health. It is that human being that needs help. And by us just churning through those cases and just supporting enough to get that blood alcohol concentration, or maybe they just think it's THC and they have a per se and we just want to get that done, we're doing such a disservice. And for decades, we have underreported drug-impaired driving. So every time we see those stats that come out from FARS or anyone else, I just shake my head because I know those aren't right. I know we're not telling the full picture. And this really got hammered home when I started doing a lot of work with NHTSA and realizing there's all these other groups out there. So the Traffic Records Coordination Committee, does anybody know what that is? Have you heard of that? Yeah, I was like, well, I'm gonna just insert myself to the TRCC and see what this is about. So I showed up, and fortunately my highway safety office is used to me, so they're like, well, that's okay, she's here. But someone was there from the Department of Health. And as I was raising my hand as they were talking about drug impaired driving and the statistics and coordinating records, I said, we don't report our data to anybody. Any data we do report is limited. Do you know our limitations? On and on and on. And the woman from Department of Health came to me and said, I work for the intoxicated driver program, and I assess those drivers that you're testing. So you're telling me you're not giving me that full story. So when I'm assessing that person and you've told me they have a blood alcohol of a 0.18, I don't really actually know, are they also an opioid user? And I said, yes, that is absolutely the case. So that launched a project at our lab to go back and test 1,000 cases that we canceled because of our cancellation policy. And it was about 70% of those cases had high blood alcohol concentration and at least one other drug on board. So again, Jennifer's arms, Christine's arms, we're getting tired. We're getting tired of raising them in the air, and we're realizing more and more our data is used in so many different ways and so many different levels, and we had no idea. So, opportunity knocks. I get a phone call from the man, the myth, the legend, Darren Grondell. You can't be surprised I told you I was going to say that. So he calls me and he says, hey, I took this new role with responsibility.org. What can we work on? So we kind of tick through a bunch of different oral fluid. You know, that's something that I've been working with Jennifer and Christine and a lot of other people, Kurt. You know, there's that. And, you know, I said, you know, there's this other idea that I've floated around to other people, but I think it's a bad idea because no one wants to do it. And so Darren says, well, you know, what is it? And I've come to know him well and I trust him. So I knew even if it was a dumb idea, he would still tell me and make me feel dumb about it, but at least it was coming from a friend. So I said, you know, we have these TSRPs in all of these states. We have the JOLs, we have law enforcement liaisons, but we don't have that for toxicology. And I absolutely know, I've been in this field long enough to know, yes, we need money. Yes, we need instrumentation. We need workforce development. We need training. We need method validations. There's all these things we need, but it's so different for every single lab where you need to plug that hole. And until you identify for every laboratory what is your barrier, we are never going to get anywhere. We're going to keep talking about needing money. We're going to talk about keep needing to get instrumentation. We're going to talk about Buy America Act. So Darren said, well, let's do it. And I was like, okay, that's nice. Months of conversations back and forth, and the National Resource Toxicologist position was born. So it was a partnership. It is a partnership between the University of Wisconsin and responsibility.org. And I remember when we were going back and forth with the MOU between the UW and responsibility.org, and you know, I had my own issues with the university to deal with, and we finally got them all figured out, and everything was signed. And I said to Darren, are you ready to jump off the cliff? And he was like, let's go. And so we have. And little did we know how long and tall and scary that cliff was going to be. We are falling at a very rapid pace, actually. Yes, in a really good way. So last year I was president-elect for SOFT, and when we signed the MOU about November, I immediately contacted the then president and said, hey, I need you to set up a committee and make me chair, because I can't do that as I'm president. I think that looks really bad. So she was like, okay. So we set up a toxicology resource committee through SOFT in December, and hit the ground running in January. And this committee is comprised of 7 or 8 of us, and we purposefully chose a mix of, we have somebody that's been in the medical examiner field for her entire career, so she has great knowledge there. We have somebody from the NIJ, or National Institute of Justice, so really great information on resources and grants. We have somebody from academia or a research institution, because one of the things we're trying to look at is pairing public forensic laboratories with academia and research institutions to maybe get some of the work done that we can't in terms of method validation, data crunching, things like that. And then the rest of us are all with publicly funded forensic toxicology laboratories. And the first thing we did was, we got to identify the problem, or maybe there isn't a problem, we've just been complaining about nothing. So we launched a survey and we ran it through SOFT because we wanted people to participate. We wanted people to trust us. We're not going to identify or share specific information. And so we launched the survey, and we surveyed about 132 labs across the country and got an 88% response rate, which was pretty fantastic. And a lot of that was because Committee members were committed to this survey, and if people didn't respond, we were calling, emailing, begging, pleading for people to complete the survey. So that was great, you know, we were so excited. And then we started to look at the data, and that's where I really started to freak out. And I think I had many counseling sessions with Darren about what did I get myself into? Because there are like kind of these big buckets that we can attack pretty quickly. You know, the committee's identified a few areas such as pairing up labs with research institutions. We think we can start sort of like a speed dating where we can kind of introduce people, figure out what's the lab specific needs, what could the research institution do or academia do for us. So that's one part of it. Another part of it, we ask labs if you're accredited or not, and there are still a few in the country that are not. So we're going to tackle that first because we feel like that's really important, and find out why aren't you accredited and what can we do to help you move that needle. So there's a lot of those big picture things that we can do, but as we started to drill into each individual state's response, it was really clear that some people are limited by statute. The resource committee can't do that, but we have advocates that can. Some people just need help validating methods, because as much as we love to get these new instruments in, it takes 9-10 months just to get that thing into production. And is there a way we can reduce that? So there's a lot of things that we've learned along the way, but particularly that the committee is a committee of volunteers. We cannot tackle this all. So to hear that NHTSA is gonna potentially go through the Regional Toxicology Liaison Program, which is just really akin to what Responsibility.org and the UW are working on, that's really what needs to happen. We need to have really specific, really focused kind of boots on the ground. So where do we go? What do we do? I think probably one of the biggest things in my platform as president of SOFT has been partnerships. We can't stand in that classroom by ourselves and sit there and jump up and down and raise our arms alone. So we know a lot of you in this room rely on toxicology, and we're going to be turning to you to ask you, can you come to the back of the classroom with us and start waving your arms too? Because just the one voice in toxicology isn't doing it. I've been really fortunate to sit on a lot of different congressional meetings and phone calls as the president of SOFT, and I'm finding that we just have always kind of been running in the background, and no one really understood the full impact that we have. And so I sit in those calls and I interrupt and I take as much time as I can, and I don't ever get slides, so this was amazing today, but I really try to just educate and inform, and it's been so helpful to have Responsibility.org have our back, because we couldn't do this without them. We need help, and they have been such a strong supporter. So we'll see how this goes. We're still chugging away, and we're gonna continue with the project and just see how much we can do, but it's overwhelming because every lab needs something and they all need something different. So we're really excited about NACID and the work that this will do as well, and how we can just kind of dovetail it all together. Thank you.
So Christine, you could have had 8 or 9 slides. We're ahead of schedule.
Right?
Yeah. Or at least bigger font. But we are ahead of schedule, so we have quite a bit of time for Q&A. So if we have anybody who has some questions for us, either from the virtual world or out in the audience. I know we had somebody asking about the labs yesterday, so hopefully, I can't imagine we answered every question that everybody had about toxicology in the last few minutes. Do we have any?
So it sounds like there's a lot of utility to using oral fluid for screening, but it seems like relatively few or a small percentage of communities are actually doing that. So we've talked about some of the reasons why, but I was wondering if you all could put kind of a finer point on it. What are the top reasons why we're not doing oral fluid screening everywhere? And what can NACID do to change that?
I mean, I can give you a perspective. One has to do with legislation. Obviously, I come from a state where it's not permitted, but the same technology that is used for blood testing is the technology that's used for oral fluid testing, and it's more sophisticated and more expensive technology. An instrument can be $300,000 to $500,000 for just to purchase. let alone all the service, the maintenance, the consumables in order to do the testing. So I think that's one of the biggest barriers that the laboratories face, is really just the technology from the confirmation side. So it's really important, I think, and Jake, I think, will highlight this a little bit more, but when we talk about oral fluid, we're talking about roadside screening, or are we talking about evidentiary laboratory forensic testing? And on the evidentiary forensic testing, the leap for the technology is pretty big.
Yeah, so an example would be in Maine. Is anyone here from Maine? So in Maine just went from being a urine state to a blood state. So that was a huge victory for them. And so they're really open to this idea of using oral fluid, but it's a non-starter in Maine because they just got blood and they're getting their labs set up for blood, and to the instrumentation process and getting something into production for oral fluid versus blood is that's a whole nother mountain they would have to climb. And they just got this victory. So it's not that there isn't recognition of the value of oral fluid in this context, but for those reasons, which are legitimate reasons, it's just a non-starter there. And there are examples like that in other parts of the country as well. And I don't know, my experience is there are a lot of states that are authorized in one way or another to collect and have an oral fluid screening and or testing program that don't even realize that they're authorized to do it because it's just new to them. They don't realize that their policy environment is conducive to that. So there's that factor. And then I'd say the other big factor to consider is the stereotypes that exist around the use of oral fluid in this context relative to the older versions of the roadside screening devices. And like that reputation is sticky with these programs. And so to Dr. Moore's point, we have to make sure that people have the latest and greatest information and understand how this technology has evolved over time.
Well, and I will,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of it too is just labs are so overwhelmed just doing the day-to-day. The thought of now adding another matrix, especially, so I'll just use Wisconsin as my example. A few years ago, we were very fortunate that because we were pushing the opioid button and working with public health, they purchased a really significant piece of instrumentation for us. It was almost $500,000. And so the laboratory decided, we're just going to validate oral fluid along with everything else. And it actually is not that much more work to do that. But I got pushback from my leadership saying, well, you're not going to use it. You're not going to collect the samples. And my response was, we cannot be that short-sighted. Yes, my focus in my lab is highway safety, but there's also biosurveillance. You know, what if we want to use oral fluid in adolescents that have been exposed to drugs? That's so much better than trying to collect their urine or their blood. Or what if we want to do non-fatal overdoses that come into the ER and we want to start doing biosurveillance? Maybe we just do oral fluid for those. So we can't, you know, I know the focus here is highway safety, and it is, and it will be a great tool, but it can go beyond that. And I think just getting people to hear that and to understand that there's bigger things that we can do with oral fluid in addition to roadside. And then the other struggle for us has just been getting somebody in my legislature to pick it up and take it, because right now we don't have oral fluid in our statute. And so we're a little nervous. Like our DREs are like, let's just do it. And the TSRPs are like, ah! So, you know, we're just at the lab like, well, you two figure it out and you let us know when you make that decision. So for us, the barrier is just legally, can we do it? Should we do it? And what are the ramifications?
And not to mention, oral fluid has been around. There's a lot of information obviously available, but relative to blood, it's newer. And with anything new, people are uncomfortable. And it's just going to take education and time to build that comfort and the willingness to try it out.
But I disagree a little bit that it's harder to do. I actually think blood's harder to do than oral fluid. Because it's much more of a background, you know, you have a lot of stuff there in the blood, where oral fluid is much cleaner, and it's the same instruments. I mean, but to your point, it takes time to validate the methods and do something different, but it's not that hard. So I wouldn't, you know, listen to the argument that, oh, it's too hard, can't do it.
Jennifer, we have an online question from Barbara Rooney, who's the governor's highway safety representative in California and the vice chair of GHSA. She asks, can you expand more on the data challenges? And I'm guessing that the point of her question really goes towards Amy's speech. Anything you can enlighten us on there?
So I think what Barbara's asking is, why do we have limited data? I work in a state that has 58 counties, has a state lab and 10 other jurisdictions that conduct toxicology. All of those laboratories make their own decision at the jurisdictional level, whether that is state, county, or municipality as to what testing they're going to do, whether they're going to do the testing in-house or whether they're going to send that testing out to someone else based on the resources they have and what they can pay for. And so what we see is something as simple as where I'm at. You can go from the border in Mexico and San Diego County up to LA County. You'll cross over the 3 largest counties in the state and you will have completely different testing in each one of those counties for the same impaired driver. And so when you're dealing with the compartmentalization of all of these jurisdictions, you know, because nobody has standardized their testing, that the data is definitely going to be fragmented. And it's a long-standing practice in the laboratories, and a lot of it is because a lot of the public crime labs, public health labs, the testing is dictated based on the adjudication process, which is one of the only areas of forensics that we actually conduct testing in that way. But we stop testing once we find something, and it could be because of statute, which we've talked about. There are some states that do that, or it's because of administrative levels, because of the blood alcohol level. And even in states like mine that have a differentiation in the code of drug only DUI, alcohol and drug DUI, or just alcohol only, we may stop testing and we're actually still underreporting that data because we're not continuing on to find out what are in people's system. I think Amy and I both know from our experiences, I'm sure Christine and Jake can share too, that even when the best labs are giving all of this information to their public entities, that information may not be getting forwarded on to the data systems. I think Amy and I both experienced that personally in the jurisdictions that we're in.
Right. Well, and to Jennifer's point too, and I think somebody asked this yesterday about standardization and why don't you just make these standards and then everyone has to follow them. You know, we're trying, as Christine talked about yesterday. We've all the toxicologists in this room have been involved in the National Safety Council guidelines, and they are such a great start. But when we, through the soft survey, we would ask people, you know, what are your barriers? And it's, yeah, I want to meet these guidelines that you've put out, but I don't have enough people, or I don't have the right instrumentation to get as low as your cutoffs are, or, you know, whatever the case may be. So even if you put standards out there, unless you're going to put funding behind that and make it so that, you know, Lab X, you have to meet this standard, but here's the funding to help you do that, we're just never going to get there. And that's really what DNA did. Yeah. They put out standards and said, this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to do it, and then here's the funding to make that happen. And that's really where we need to be for toxicology.
Yeah, DNA set a national standard that everybody has to comply with, no matter what. And then they actually assess to that standard to ensure compliance, so obligating compliance. And then yearly, laboratories are provided a set amount of money every year in formula grants, non-competitive money, whereas all of the other forensic disciplines, including toxicology, compete for a much smaller pot. And Kirk's laughing back there. And you know, we used to all stand with our hands in the air, and I now oversee a DNA program too, and it really is incredible the disparity between the forensic disciplines, because we're stopping our testing on cases where we would never stop in other types of these disciplines. So we've been saying this for a while, that if someone could just get us on that train that DNA was on, that it might help a lot. But.
Just another point to add, and we talked about looking into this before this conference, and so I did a little homework for you. So Jennifer had asked, you know, when cannabis is liberalized in a state, there's always some portion of tax revenue that goes to highway safety. How many states are getting a portion of that tax revenue going to the laboratory for the kinds of things that we're talking about at this conference? And so we looked into it, and so there's always some proportion of that tax revenue that goes to highway safety. What is less common is specific itemization as to how much of that highway safety tax revenue goes to education versus this versus that. Those are state level decisions made in state government. So I don't know how realistic it is to get that kind of earmarking in the bill that legalizes cannabis and dictates what proportion, like if you can get more detailed than that. But if not, you got to work with the Highway Safety Office. You have to work with state lawmakers to figure out, all right, that money's going to highway safety, how much can we have? So you're going to have to be standing up in the classroom with your arms up again, at least in the near term, if that is going to be a venue to get some resources.
And we have been fortunate in California that through Canvas, it's a brand new grant that came out this year that came through law enforcement. So the California Highway Patrol, because they are in every county, did opt to allot a certain amount of money. They actually granted $10.6 million in funding to the California Public Crime Labs to address the toxicology challenges. And I can tell you, as someone who is benefiting from the funding, it's been a game changer. So if you are working on cannabis legislation, understand that there are impacts, and that those impacts, if there is revenue, if you want to help traffic safety, you got to fund the people who are testing the drivers. You have to.
But to your point, that's not a sustainable funding stream either, because tax revenue is variable over time.
Right.
And so you can't build up this capacity depending on some level of funding that might change in the next year, for example. So,
do we have any other questions?
I do.
Darren.
No, you don't.
This is an easy one. When you're talking about DNA and tox labs, we had a situation in Washington where I just wanted to see if part of an educational piece for legislators and for Congress is, do they understand the differentiation between a crime lab and a tox lab? So oftentimes when they're given new policies or appropriations to say, oh, this is going to the crime lab, in their mind, they think that that's going to be apportioned to a tox lab. And that happened to us. And I just want to make sure that as we go forward, is that something that we should be doing, is really talking about those differences. And when policy and appropriations go, is that they know are clear on where that money's going.
Yeah, I am a little different than most labs because I'm in a public health lab instead of through like a criminal justice system. So I'm really lucky. The UW, is very supportive. And then I have a separate crime lab system in Wisconsin, and their tox group is always, raising their arms. And so recently they were allocated some funding to the crime lab. And the same thing happened. All of a sudden, I'm talking to the tox folks and like, we're going to get a new instrument. We're going to get all these people. And then a few months later, I check in. I'm like, hey, how's that going? Do you want any of our methods? Can we help you in any way? And they said, nope, we ended up not getting enough funding to really do much. They got some, which often happens. You'll get $20,000 and you're like, great, I can buy some new pens. I mean, it's just, you don't want to sound ungrateful, but it's not enough. And it goes to the other disciplines then instead. So being very specific about where that funding goes is really important, because people just kind of mash the crime lab together and all those disciplines and assume people are going to duke it out. And every time that happens, toxicology usually gets the raw end.
Jennifer, we have another online question. It's from Jennifer Cohen-Taubman, and she's with Hound Labs. And I think her question is, what type of focus has there been on developing a marijuana or cannabis breath test?
Well, Hound Labs are the ones that do it.
Yeah, there are a few I know that are proposed projects for breath in marijuana, and actually they're looking at other things than what we would normally consider, Delta 9 THC. They're looking at other things instead of trying to measure the parent. But it needs a lot of research yet, I would say.
And I would go, please.
I think that the technology that has been used is that they collect the breath and then send that to the laboratory.
So that's happening in Europe. There's a sense abuse product that happens. So it's not a roadside test. It's not an instant test, but you can do certain drugs that have to be volatile, obviously, to be in the breath. But it has been done, it has been published. So the next stage would be a roadside breathalyzer for drugs would be nice, but we've been hearing that there's going to be one for quite a few years, and I haven't seen one yet, so.
I'd say from like a public policy and efficiency standpoint, let's just assume that a breath test for marijuana use is perfect and reliable 100% of the time. We've heard, it's very clear in this room, I think, to everyone, the funding challenges and why we aren't using oral fluid, either screening at roadside or in the laboratory for confirmation purposes, and the funding barriers to do that. Why would we invest the limited resources we have in a tool for one drug when we know now without hesitation that it's multiple substance impaired driving that is a problem? And so why would we limit ourselves in that way? And this isn't meant to be a criticism of how labs, but it's just, I don't understand the efficiency in that policy approach for this topic.
Because I think law enforcement will be the first ones to tell you how many different tools are they supposed to take with
Right.
them. I mean, just from a practical standpoint, those motors who do a lot of traffic, there's only so much room in what they can carry. So, I mean, I think from a practical standpoint,
Yeah.
and we're here to tell you that the comprehensive testing needs to take place. I did have one question if we have time for the folks here. The National Safety Council recommendations, the first publication was in 2007, and we're all huge advocates for getting these recommendations and applying them. But what do you, I think we're on maybe our 4th or 5th generation of those recommendations. What do you think needs to happen? Because we're really only at about 40% compliance. So what has to happen for us to even get to maybe 80% compliance?
I think it's a little bit of, well, obviously it's the funding, that's a big part of it, but there is also, you need buy-in from the lab. During our last consensus meeting for the recommendations, we actually had somebody comment back, why are you trying to test for marijuana so low? Why bother? We know it's out there, we know it goes away quickly. You know, all these cons about how long it takes for testing, because even after the sample is collected, we still lose some of that drug as it sits in the blood tube. So we know that there's just not 100% buy-in by laboratories too. So, and that's one of the things that through the partnership with responsibility.org and the National Resource Toxicologist position, we're trying to figure out, and then how do you turn that boat? And it's not going to be the resource committee that's going to do it. It's probably going to be reaching out to highway safety or someone else within that state to help send that message to that lab that, like we've been preaching here, until we're all doing the same thing, we're never going to have analogous data across the country. And so standardization is just really important.
Jake, I have a question for you in terms of policy. What needs to happen? Are we better off? Alcohol and alcohol testing in many states is very well regulated. We have a conforming products list. Certain states have very specific mandates about how they have to test. What needs to happen? Are we better off setting up those standards ourselves through accreditation and our national standard working groups? Or do you think that if we pursued legislation that actually obligated the states to meet these standards for drug testing, that it would actually bring the funding that the laboratories need and staffing and the infrastructure and all those things? Like, what do you think the best course of action is?
Yeah, I would recommend doing what you're doing, like find the routes to get to where you need to be through the kinds of projects that you described with responsibility.org. I mean, you described that, and then you shared that NHTSA might be doing something similar. So that's fantastic, but we have to act in the meantime. Government doesn't move quick, and any legislation to force these standards, for example, are more times than not going to come without the funding to make it happen. So I don't think we should wait for that. I think we should pursue it, but we should find other paths to get there in the interim and hope that at some point government can pick up where those other efforts have left off. And so like thinking about oral fluid, roadside oral fluid devices, we don't have a model specs or conforming devices list right now from the federal government, and we're not going to have that even if they were authorized tomorrow for many years. So we shouldn't not pursue oral fluid programs in the interim. We should stay on top of the developments and advancements in that technology as we move forward and make sure that we're all educating each other about that and making the best choices for our state and our program. And when model specs come out and conforming devices come out, if we're doing our job, chances are most programs will be compliant with those recommendations anyway.
Jennifer, we have another online question from Jose Carrion. Do we have research and data that predicts how many lives will be saved if we implement a saliva screening program? How much money will be saved taking into account the cost to America in other areas like quality of life, insurance, hospitalizations?
That's a good question. How do you know if somebody's going to crash?
We're all looking at each other, and that's a really good question.
It's a good question, but
One of the speakers yesterday mentioned something about a state whose switch in program saved through efficiencies like $30,000. What was that? Is that really Utah?
Utah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
phlebotomy.
Thought I had something there, but I don't.
So I guess the answer is we don't exactly know.
We have another question out here.
So just curious, I'm involved with those individuals that have already been convicted that find themselves on probation or parole. Can you speak a little bit about oral fluid testing for that population versus urinalysis testing?
Well, I know that it's used in various agencies in the country, especially there's a big laboratory in California that do a lot of criminal justice testing using oral fluid. The folks involved for the collections find it so much easier than having to collect urines because often they're observed urines, which nobody wants to do.
Amen.
So that's certainly an advantage to the oral fluid is you can observe the collection pretty easily and do that. So in that situation, I think it's also very helpful to do. But the urines are so much quicker and easier to do automation-wise in the lab. So it's, again, to
Yeah, not
point,
quicker when you're doing the observing, that's for sure. But
yeah, we don't want to do that.
I find that's really exciting because for those people convicted, all you need is presence. We don't need to worry about impairment because typically they already have terms that forbid them from using any kind of drugs. But it seems like right now the biggest stickler when it comes to oral fluid testing is just price point.
Well, and I think the challenge too with probation and parole is they know they're not supposed to consume. And so oftentimes that's when we see the use of synthetic cannabinoids or something that they know won't trigger that positive test if it's a rapid device. So that's why oral fluid is great because you can collect it and still get a lot of that information, but you're going to have to wait for the results and send it off.
Right.
Christine, it came up since you brought this up. How long, how long does it take until drugs appear in the oral fluid? Because I think also to the point, urine is a historical sample. That's why it's not great for I'll get on Christine's bandwagon. It's not a good sample for DUI. You're trying to determine impairment or influence. It's not a good sample. It really is about history, which it is helpful for probation, right? To find out if they, used a couple days ago as opposed to right now. So maybe you can address that, Christine, of how long it takes for them to start to appear.
So that's a great question, and it depends a lot on the route of administration. So if you smoke or vape a particular drug, it's going to be there immediately in the oral fluid because it's in the mouth right there. If you do IV injections of like cocaine or heroin, those are pretty quick. Those are within minutes that show up in the saliva. But more tablets like oxycodone maybe and those types of things, those take a while because then they have to circulate through the body and come back out through the blood into the saliva. So it depends. And it also depends how low you're testing as to how far back you can find that drug. So the cutoff is really important for that. So if you test really low, obviously your window of detection is much longer. So like everything, it depends.
Do you have a question in the back? No? All right. I think we're going to wrap this up then.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.